In the mid-1990s, a system of psychological monitoring was integrated into American schools. It entered routine as simple, benign questionnaires during class. The effects of this documentation would not be clear for years. This was just one part of a much broader pattern. It began in schools. Not with new curriculum, not with updated textbooks, but with questionnaires, simple forms handed out during class time, sometimes during health education, sometimes integrated into what were called wellness checks or student support initiatives. The questions seemed benign. How do you feel today? Do you feel safe at home? Have you felt sad or worried lately? Do your parents argue? Does anyone in your family drink alcohol? Children filled them out with pencils, sometimes crayons. They were told this was normal, that it helped the school understand them better, that caring adults needed this information to keep them safe. Most parents never saw these forms. Many never knew they existed. When they did find out, often months or years later, they were told the screenings were part of federal or state mandates tied to funding, connected to child welfare laws, or simply described as best practices. The language used was always about safety, about early intervention, about identifying children who might be at risk. The term at risk expanded quietly. At first, it meant children facing clear neglect or abuse. Then it broadened to include emotional distress, then behavioral issues, then family stress, then anything that deviated from an increasingly narrow definition of normal childhood emotional response. A child who seemed withdrawn, a child who seemed too energetic, a child who drew dark pictures. Teachers were trained to notice, not just academic struggles, but emotional patterns. They were given checklists, rubrics, guidelines on what to report, not to parents first, but to school counselors, psychologists, social workers. A parallel system of documentation began, running alongside report cards and attendance records, behavioral files, emotional profiles, risk assessments. Some parents discovered these files only when transferring their child to a new school. This wasn't unique to one district or one state. It was happening nationally, driven by overlapping federal policies, grant programs, and public health initiatives. The language was always compassionate. The intention, at least on the surface, appeared protective. But the mechanism was the same. Information was being gathered about children's inner lives, their family dynamics, their emotional states. And that information was being stored, analyzed, and sometimes shared, all without explicit parental knowledge or consent. Most people never noticed this at the time. The forms blended into the administrative background of school life. They were presented with the same casual authority as permission slips for field trips or vaccination records. Children trusted the adults handing them out. Parents, when they were informed at all, were told this was about student wellness, about making sure no child fell through the cracks. The framing made objections seem unreasonable. But beneath that framing was a structural shift. Childhood was being redefined as a space requiring constant emotional surveillance. The assumption embedded in these systems was that children's psychological states needed to be monitored by institutions, that deviations from emotional norms were early warning signs requiring intervention, and that parents either couldn't be trusted to recognize these signs or couldn't be relied upon to act appropriately. The tools used were often developed by pharmaceutical companies, mental health organizations, or education consultants. They carried names like Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, Behavioral and Emotional Screening System, Social Emotional Learning Assessments. They were marketed as evidence-based, scientifically validated. School districts adopted them through grants, through state mandates, through partnerships with health organizations. What they created was a feedback loop. Screening identified children who scored outside designated ranges. Those children were flagged for follow-up. Follow-up often meant meetings with school counselors, referrals to outside therapists, sometimes meetings with child protective services. The referrals generated data. The data justified expanded screening. And it was designed to operate quietly. The forms were administered during school hours, so parents weren't present. Results were communicated through professional channels, counselor to counselor, agency to agency, often without direct parental notification unless intervention was deemed necessary. The real impact appeared years later. Not in any single visible event, but in the accumulated weight of a generation growing up under this kind of scrutiny. Children who learned early that their feelings were being observed, categorized, and documented. That expressing sadness or frustration wasn't just a private experience, but something that could trigger official responses. That honesty on a form could lead to adults showing up at their home, asking questions, making assessments about their family. Some children learned to answer these screenings strategically, to perform emotional stability, to give responses that wouldn't flag them for follow-up. Others didn't understand the stakes and answered honestly, not realizing that saying, "Yes, my parents argue sometimes," could set institutional processes in motion. By the time these children reached adolescence and adulthood, the psychological landscape had been fundamentally altered. They had been taught, implicitly, that emotional experience was something to be managed by systems, that deviations from prescribed norms were problems requiring correction, that privacy around inner life was not a right, but a privilege that could be revoked in the name of well-being. This wasn't framed as an intrusion, it was framed as care, and that made it harder to resist, harder to question, harder even to recognize. Parents who objected were often met with institutional pressure. School administrators would explain that these screenings were required, that refusal could impact the child's access to services, that opting out marked the family as uncooperative. Some states enshrined these practices in law, making certain forms of psychological screening mandatory. Others left it to individual districts, creating a patchwork where some children were subjected to intensive emotional monitoring and others weren't, based solely on where they lived. The companies developing these screening tools had financial incentives to expand their use. Each new school district that adopted a screening program represented revenue. Each identification of an at-risk child created demand for follow-up services, therapeutic interventions, sometimes pharmaceutical treatments. The system was self-sustaining not because it was necessarily effective, but because it generated its own justification through the data it produced. This was structural. It was built into the architecture of public education, public health policy, child welfare systems. It wasn't the result of individual malice, but of overlapping bureaucratic mandates, funding incentives, liability concerns, and a cultural shift toward treating childhood as a domain requiring expert intervention rather than one primarily governed by family autonomy. The justification was always harm prevention, but the mechanism was surveillance, and the surveillance was non-consensual. Children couldn't consent to having their emotional lives documented. Parents often weren't informed enough to give meaningful consent. The system didn't ask, it simply proceeded. The cultural narrative around mental health during this period made questioning these systems particularly fraught. Mental health awareness campaigns encouraged talking about feelings, reducing stigma, seeking help early. These were positive developments in many ways, but they also created cover for surveillance systems that operated under the banner of mental health support. The rhetoric of care obscured the reality of control. Children were being sorted, categorized, and tracked based on psychological assessments they didn't understand and couldn't refuse. The sorting happened early, often before children had developed stable personalities or coping mechanisms. And once sorted, the categories were sticky. This pattern didn't stop with psychological screening. It extended into other domains. Behavioral tracking apps that monitored children's conduct in real time. Learning management systems that recorded every click, every assignment, creating detailed digital profiles. Social-emotional learning curricula that required students to self-report feelings daily, generating longitudinal emotional data. Each innovation was presented as progress, as more responsive education, as better support for children's holistic development, and each one expanded the infrastructure of surveillance, the mechanisms through which children's inner lives became institutional data. Similar decisions followed in other contexts, creating a broader architecture of monitoring that extended beyond schools, beyond mental health, into the everyday texture of how childhood itself was understood and managed. And that pattern didn't stop there.